I am not a walking preacher. In fact, you could say I aspire to be a preacher when I grow up. Thank you for coming, and let me tell you who I am. I have no intent to offend anybody if you're of the Catholic faith. I am the son of a missionary to Italy from the 1960s. From our fellowship, there were about 30 that hit those lands in that decade. Dr. Mike Payton is one of those sons of a missionary from the 50s and 60s, and Lynn, his wife, is here too. So there are two of us that speak what I jokingly, watch out, I'm teasing, say is the language of God, Italian or Latin. What if you get to heaven and God doesn't speak English? There's the question. I was taken over when I was 4, and when my father was barely there 6 months, he was challenged by the Bishop of Palermo, Italy, the largest city of the island of Sicily in Italy, to a public debate on Catholic issues, dogmas, etc. So he hit the ground running with regard to learning the language to do a debate. But there is the reality in which I grew up. I went to schools in Florence, Italy, in the north, and there I did junior high and senior high, and I was the only American in a school of 500 Italians. And religion hour, which was twice a week, was was taught by a nun. So while most of my Catholic friends, classmates, were not as interested in discussing theology in junior high and senior high, you might imagine why. But I had conversations with the nun. She knew I was the only what she called Protestant. I'm not a Protestant. I haven't protested anything that I know of in my life. But in Italy, if you're growing up there in those decades, you're either Catholic or Protestant. When you die, you're either buried in Catholic cemetery or Protestant cemetery. It doesn't matter. There are two categories of people. That's changed a little bit now, but I say that to tell you that I respect. In my professional life, when I took my family back, I lived 14 years over there before. Then I went back with my family. I've been blessed with 6 children and a wife. She had to learn Italian as I directed study abroad programs over there for American universities, 3 different ones. But that said, I hired Catholic staff because that was a necessary thing. And I learned to be not only interested in, but respectful of where they were coming from. So any comments that I make about that history, and I'll ask you to turn on, if you would, the PowerPoint of that says, click to the next. Okay, so there it is right there. This topic, to me, I'm going to come back on an issue of abortion later on, and I'm going to say, I'm going to use a different approach to it. What happens first when your church leaves you? My father-in-law was a Catholic, by the way. He was baptized into New Testament Christianity in the last 7 years of the church, but for many years, I had to not only love but also respect where he was coming from a St. Louis traditional Catholic family that went to Mass, paid for indulgences, said prayers to saints, etc. So love, respect, care. Um, like in the years that I was in Greece directing programs, I had to learn to understand, study, respect Greek Orthodox Church. It is important if you're going to have dialogues with them to know where they're coming from. Sometimes they don't know their own history. I found that to be true of some Muslims too. In Athens about 2 years ago, I was speaking with about 40 Iranians that I did not speak their language of Arabic or Farsi, so I had a translator there, but they were unaware of what details we have of the life of Muhammad, of the biography of Muhammad. They did ask me, why is it that we know so much about the biography of Christ? I said, because what he lived and is needs to match what he said too, what he did and what he said. And here's the point: many Muslims don't know the biography of Muhammad, and many of my Catholic friends don't know the story of how the church left them. I say that in respect and love, and that's where I want to go here. It is not picking on the largest denomination in the U.S. They have been in the news all week. Okay, they are all the time. I'm not in the news, but the leadership of the Vatican. Vatican is a hill in Rome on which there was founded the Church of St. Peter's in Rome. And they are in the news a lot, especially in the last 2 to 3 decades or more. My colleagues are going to speak to various trends. I'm going to deal with a walk through how the church left New Testament Christianity, and I'm going to do that in a very tactful, respectful way because I care about my Catholic friends. Vatican says gender theory surrogacy violates human dignity and ethic documents. I teach a course at Freed-Hardeman right now for seniors in some of the most controversial ethical and moral issues going on today, from puberty blockers to transgender surgeries to same-sex marriages. All of these have happened since they were born. They're 21 years old, but they're having to deal with ethical and moral issues that are brand new, that haven't been addressed before. And when the media or news agencies or when go to ask some denomination or religion about this, they go to the Vatican, they go to the popes, they see what is being done. This is on the last Monday of this week. That is a major document, 5 years in the making, from one of the major councils in Rome. It's called the Dicastero della Dottrina della Fede, which is in English translated Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. It's in the news as to what does the Pope, what does the Vatican say about gender theory, a major development in the last 10 years in our culture, and how about surrogate motherhood as well. Well, that's why it is important to invest in to know as much or more sometimes about the story of how Catholic doctrine came to be in Catholic practice as well. You see, last December, it was kind of a shock, and my colleagues are going to refer to it more, when there was a council, but of a lower level within the Catholic organization, that saw Pope Francis I, the current leader since 2013 of the Catholic Church. Pope Francis formally approved letting Catholic priests bless same-sex couples. The Vatican announced Monday a radical shift in policy that aimed at making the church more inclusive while maintaining a strict ban on gay marriage. Can't call it marriage. That's a God thing. That's a biblical thing. But where the Catholic believers were left, okay, so priests can bless just unions of same sex, but they can't bless and perform rituals and use their liturgy for a blessing of same-sex marriages. So what does that mean? Is that opening a door? And we'll talk about that later. That's why we deal with this. You see, when a bishop of Tyler, Texas, is demoted by Pope Francis I, as happened to this gentleman right here, Strickland. Well, that makes the news. And what was he saying? He was saying, as a conservative Catholic, he was saying, I don't trust the current leadership in the Vatican. That should not just, it should concern us, because culture has influenced a lot of things over the last 20 centuries in the growth of the church. Here's the point. Why should I invest in what's the story of Catholic Christianity? In a world of 7.9 billion people, 1.378 is the last number, are baptized Catholics, most of them from birth, some of them as adults. It's been much more rare since the 13th century, to be honest with you. If you take the generic number of using the word Christendom in a very generic sense, and I'll use the word church in a very generic sense too. If there are 2.38 billion out of 7.9 billion people, there are 2.38 billion that are said to be Christians of some kind, Christendom. Well, 58% of that number right there is claiming some affiliation or complete affiliation, mass-going Catholics as such. One of the interesting things, if you look at other data about recent 20th century uh, shifts of the Catholic Church has been that from 1910 to 2010, they went from being mostly European in number, over 65% of Catholics were in Europe, to in modern day times in the 21st century, Europe has shrunk to 24% are in Europe. And so there's been a major decrease in affiliation of the Catholic Church in Europe, but a much larger increase in Latin America, in sub-Saharan Africa, and especially in the Asian Pacific. So there's been a major shift in that particular denomination as such. U.S., our particular context, large Catholic presence in Ohio, but not just Ohio. Those are counties of the United States. Not looking at it from a state point of view, but from a county point of view. Blue is where there's a prominent Catholic presence, while Southern Baptist is the red presence right there. In the 2020 survey, it reported there were 61 million Catholics. Other numbers I've seen have shown me 81 million. That said, one of the questions that's going to be in the Catholic literature of the U.S. is going to be the difference between regular mass attending, baptizing their children when they're young, catechism, and many other things, including the aware of the positions of the church on particular social issues, not just attending church, but also we still have in our family, in my wife's family, some of those that are of that category. That is traditional Catholics, mass-going Catholics. And my father-in-law was baptized into the New Testament Christianity in the last 7 years of his life. But that said, we still have love and respect and care and concern for those that are still holding on to that. Pope Francis I is the 266th Pope in the history of the papacy. Now, I'll make one caveat here, one note. When you talk about the 4th century AD, 17 centuries ago, it is not unanimous as to who knew they were a pope and what list of popes you go. If you look at the list of that are sculpted in marble in St. Peter's or in St. John Lateran churches in Rome, you will see a list. But if you look back in the times of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century, one, did they know they were a pope? And secondly, which list do you go by? But that said, Francis I took over in 2013. He took over because only 2 popes in the history of the papacy have retired. One was Benedict XVI that retired in 2013. He was pope from 2005 to 2013, 8 years. He couldn't afford physically the travel. That was the main reason he gave. There's only been one other pope in the history of papacy that retired, Celestine V, back in the 13th century. And popes in general die in situ, on their seat, on their place. Rome has been the place since the 6th century, okay? Let me make sure you understand that's not always been the case. To define it as Roman Catholic Church, first of all, you have to take that term Catholic, remind yourself that it means universal, okay? That's the origin of it. And really the denomination called Catholicism can only be used since the year 1054. That's when the first schism, they call it the Great Schism, between Eastern and Western, Latin-speaking and Greek-speaking, Greek Orthodoxy. It's been 1,000 years since the first major split in Christendom took place. Francis I is the first non-European pope since, well, the 14th century. They've all been Italian, except for the last 3 that have been Polish and German. And he is Italo-Argentinian, first one from South America. And before that, they were all Italian up until, go back till the 14th century, when there was about 72 years of French popes. That is referred to in history as the Babylonian captivity, when popes were taken away by French King Philip IV, parked in not Rome anymore, but Avignon, France, where you will find a papal palace that was used for about 70 years instead of St. Peter's or the Vatican Hill, where they have been for most of their time. Now, here is a quick walk through history, and I will stop once I see that clock turn a certain moment, or I'll watch your eyelids go down. I don't want to go past that. Where did it start? Where did it start? Christianity, the beginnings of Christianity are an amazing story, the greatest exponential growth of any faith in the history of mankind. God was involved. Okay, it wasn't just the Apostle Paul with his missionary journeys. When on the day of Pentecost in about the year 30 AD, it went from 120 people to 3,120, Acts chapter 2. Then is a explosion in spite of persecution the first 35 years by the Jews, and then beginning with the Roman authorities, beginning after the year 64 AD. Okay, and it goes, this is a study by a non-believer called Rodney Stark in a work in 1996. He is a non-believer, but he said it is an amazing story. And he formulated some conservative numbers about the explosion of Christianity within a pagan world of about 80 million people at the time of the Mediterranean world. It went from the year 30 AD, he says, 7,530. Look at the number by the time we get to the 4th century. It's 35 million. If the population of the world of the Mediterranean was about 80 million, well, you're talking a growth from nothing on the scene of history to about half the population of the world by the time Christianity is legalized and then made the official religion of the world. Here's a thing that had to happen in that massive growth. You got to get organized. And that organization will begin to show some of the pains of growth, I guess you could say. And maybe one could say also some of the errors of growth. Sometimes in the name of growth, you make some decisions about organizing things that turn out to be, well, Jesus said to Pilate, face to face, I'm not a threat to you. I'm not into politics. And he also said things like, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. We're not going to do it the ways of man. Leadership and power and politics, we're not going to do it that way. My kingdom of heaven is not your kingdom, he will say to Pilate very much. That teaching should have resonated more as the numbers grew exponentially within the Roman Empire. And there was a need to organize. So the first organization within the Roman Empire of, as you see from the book of Acts, the spread of the gospel through the missionary journeys to the great cities of Rome, Antioch, of Syria, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, Athens, Corinth, Philippi, Thessalonica, and the list goes on of cities, Alexandria of Egypt, etc. Well, organization, getting organized, when you have the pews, so to speak, they didn't have pews back then, but fill up was essential. But so dioceses and, of course, bishops. Bishop, of course, we know from the use of the Greek term in the New Testament record, there are 3 terms for it, and they all refer to the way in which the early church organized. Deacons and elders, 2 offices. There's no doubt about that being the case. But as the numbers grew and as the need for organization grew, there began to be a group of bishops in which there was a head bishop. And that's the beginning of the consolidation of who's going to be the top guy in Christendom when it becomes the official religion of the world. Please make note, there are 2 graphs that you should have in mind. One is the rise of the church within the collapse of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was about politics and power and money and domination, militarily speaking. The church is not supposed to be any of those things. Any of those things. It's about the kingdom of heaven. But as the Roman Empire collapsed, the Christianity grew up and was one of the only things organized, as Roman emperors only survived about 2 years each during the early 3rd century. And then by the 5th century, Rome collapsed completely by 476. And Rome is gone, the emperor is gone, barbarians have taken over, but the only thing organizing things, schools, and where do you get a birth certificate for your son, and many other things like that. The only thing left is the church. It's organizing the chaos that the collapse of the Roman Empire and barbarians had. And of course, here's another thing that caused them to make some choices where the church starts leaving apostolic tradition, leaving believers behind, is in that fighting of heresies, which have been there from the very beginning of the church. In the letters of two of the writers of the New Testament. There's the pre-Gnostic teachings that were very concerning, and they will really damage the church in the early second century. But the big heresies that come along are Arianism and also Docetism. When Christianity was highly persecuted by the Emperor Diocletian in the late third century, 290s. Some of the worst killings in mass persecutions of Christians. Well, there were those that reneged the faith because they wanted to spare their lives, save their lives. Understandable. But still, what do you do with Christians that reneged the faith under Roman imperial persecution? And then when Christianity was legalized in 313, they're still alive. Do you take them back? Docetism, Arianism, Donatism, there are many heresies that the church leaders have to fight. They wanted to make two classes of Christians. Those who had stayed faithful to the church during persecutions and those who didn't. They were told they couldn't rise to leadership in the church and many others. And the church leaders had to say, no, you can't have two levels of Christians, you know, first level and second level, first tier and second tier. We're all brothers and sisters in Christ, even if in your past you renege Christ. All this to say, things happened during these centuries, so to speak. After the legalization of Christianity under Emperor Constantine in 313 AD, his mother, Helen, I think, was a true believer. I have to question the, I have at least a question mark about Constantine. He is said to have received a vision in the night before, the days before the battle, the Milvian Bridge in Rome, as he was trying to be the emperor of Rome, but he had a competitor called Maximilian, and they had each legions of Rome, and he is said to have had a vision in which, in Latin, Jesus evidently spoke Latin, in this case, in hoc signo vinces, four words that mean, and you will see this on Catholic crucifixes, IHS, with this sign you will win. So he replaces the sign of the Roman eagle, which is a symbol of the Roman legions, with the sign of the cross. And that is the narrative, at least. What did Constantine really have the day or the week before this important battle that won him the emperorship? Was it a vision or was it information from his commanders that said, do you realize by the year 312, how many of your legionnaires, your fighters, are actually secretly converted to Christianity, which had been heavily persecuted just a decade before, heavier than any other. The map right here shows you that after Constantine legalized Christianity with the Edict of Milan in 313, the dark green spots, which is where concentrations of Christians were, went light green, which is everywhere, okay? A lot of pagans came sincerely or less streaming in because it had been legalized. Paganism was struggling, it was bankrupt. Pagan temples were dropping in their attendance, and they will completely collapse just 60 years later when Emperor Theodosius will proclaim the Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. And that was a tragic error, in my opinion. I'm just a student. I'm not a scholar, by the way. He will make a gigantic mistake because that brought in people that thought they wanted a state job or a job with the empire. They thought you have to convert to the new faith. So there's less of a sincere motive to switch from pagan gods to Christian gods here. The papacy. My Catholic friends, and they have them sculpted in marble, have a list. So Pope Francis I and Benedict XVI and Pope Ratzinger and John Paul II, John Paul I, Paul VI. Those are the last 5, 6 popes. John the 23rd of the 1960s and 70s. They are in a long line, they say, of vicars of Christ on earth. Vicar meaning a representative of Christ on earth. Where'd the papacy come from? You see the picture in there of the gorgeous, completed, about 1650 dome designed by Michelangelo. And the interior part of that massive drum, which is 140 feet in diameter, has gigantic letters quoting Matthew 16 and verse 18. You are Peter, and upon this rock I will found my church. They're in Latin, of course. Tu es Petrus, et an Petram, I will found my church. This is a statement in the 17th century by popes who were smarting from the Protestant breakaway. They had lost a lot of faithful and territories, and they were saying, no, the papacy is representative of, goes back, has its roots in Peter. And Peter was a primus inter pares, first among equals, and many other terms that are used for the head of Christendom ever since. Well, Jesus said these words in Matthew 16:18. That is a passage, of course, that finds myself and my Catholic friends differing. Peter said what the other apostles had come to believe as well, that Jesus was both the Messiah and was the Son of God. Two important statements. But it wasn't just Peter. Jesus, in that context, was blessing both Peter directly because he spoke up, and also everybody like you, I hope, that proclaims Jesus to have been both Son of God and the announced Messiah of the Old Testament. Where did the papacy come from? Please make note that there were 5 different geographical locations in the first few centuries that would have been the epicenter of Christendom as it spread throughout the world of that time. Now, Jerusalem would have been my pick, but there could have been also Antioch of Syria, where you have in the book of Acts a very important, mostly Gentile church, which is prospering with Paul and Barnabas, etc., among the leaders there. It could have been Alexandria of Egypt. There were 5 geographical spots that could have been the epicenter of Christianity or Christendom in the world. But you know which one won. Pope lives in Rome, and he has been since the 6th century. Okay, Rome will become, why Rome? Let me dare, and again, my Catholic friends, as Rome collapses, the church starts taking on a polity, an organization, like the Roman Empire. Roman Empire was made of imperial family, senatorial classes, equestrian classes, and you keep going down the ladder until you get to the lower rim, which is slaves at the time. In the organization of the church, when Rome and its organization collapses, you have, by the time of the collapse of the Roman Empire, a very similar polity organization. There's a pope in Rome. There are cardinals. There are archbishops. There are bishops. And you go to priests. Then you go to deacons. And then you have the division that in the New Testament I can't find. We are all priests of the priesthood of believers. But by the time of the 5th century, you've got this ladder of ecclesiastical hierarchy that is, in a sense, replicating or modeling the Roman one. And at the bottom is, of course, the lay people. There's now clergy and laity, something that, of course, the Old Testament Hebrew situation had, but in New Testament Christianity, I cannot find. Here are some instances. Jesus said one time, Matthew 23, to his apostles, don't call anybody rabbi. Don't call anybody father. Yet the term that if you are in St. Peter's, I met John Paul II in one of my tours of St. Peter's Cathedral. I've given many. I have studied its construction and organization of the physical structure of the greatest temple to God on earth. It took 150 years. It's the most talented. Art history is part of my thing. So John Paul II came out of the side door with his Vatican guards, Swiss guards, and also with his media with him, came up and talked to my group. I did not bow down to him, which is how you show respect. I have respect for that gentleman. He spoke 7 languages fluently, found out where we're from, and switched our language, okay? But that said, do I recognize him as Vicar of Christ on earth? Is the Holy Father, Santo Padre, is he the Holy Father? And you don't shake hands, you kneel down and you kiss as he offers you the papal ring that is a symbol of his authority? And that's the question. Two of the biggest things that you have to ask yourself as you study Catholic history is who's the authority? And secondly, who do you worship? One of both. What I find in the third, fourth, and fifth century, as you go towards the establishment of the papacy in Rome, is that some bishops in Rome, Damasus, he starts requiring those below him, so to speak. He calls them sons, not brothers. If you are in Christ, you are my brother. If you are in Christ, you are my sister. We are on the same level spiritually and whatever else way we want to. But the difference of calling a son, my son, well, that speaks of levels. Leo I in the 5th century requires people to call him Holy Father, where there again, what do you do with Matthew 23? Clearly, I know that the papacy in Rome is established by the time of the end of the 6th century when Gregory I, yes, it's the one that established Gregorian chant. As a wonderful tradition of monophonic music within the early church, inheriting some of the hymns of the early church and establishing them as being kept and promoted in the centuries to follow. Holy Father, what was Jesus saying? Was he just talking about the Pharisees? When the apostles heard Jesus say, don't call anyone rabbi, don't call anyone Holy Father. There's only one Father in heaven. Well, obviously, Jesus was referring to the Pharisees, but that said doesn't apply any other time. This is in one of the side frescoes of the Sistine Chapel today. Hope you get to go visit it if you haven't. Perugino is a great artist, and when he was called in the private chapel of the popes that was built in the 15th century, that will be made famous by Michelangelo a few years later, one of the major paintings is about Christ consigning the keys to heaven. To whom? Well, to Peter, the one kneeling down. The front row is Jesus giving the keys to heaven. When a pope is chosen today, it's called conclave, which in Latin means with a key. That's the key to the Sistine Chapel. But more specifically here, the symbol of the Catholic doctrine is Jesus gave to Peter, of all the apostles, he gave it to him, the keys to what? The Sistine Chapel? No, to heaven, to heaven. When in 1054, the patriarch of Greek-speaking church of the eastern part of the empire split with the Pope in Rome, they sent letters of extradition to each other. And a letter of extradition from a pope, still today, means I'm shutting the keys to heaven to you. I'm sending you, therefore, I'm condemning you to. And popes have done recently with fallen away bishops. They've actually closed the keys of heaven. Do they have those keys? That's the question. The issue of church and state. We now happily believe in separation of church and state in our political landscape. That's good, but that was not the case in ancient times. Emperors were the head of the pagan religion. Okay, that's what happened back then. So when there become to be popes in Rome, the tendency to mix politics with religion is very strong here. And so the role of emperors in the church, who convenes the Council of Nicaea in 325? Catholic Church gets its teachings from three different sources. The Bible that you have, the Old Testament is only different that it has 7 extra books than the Protestant, so to speak. It gets it from ecumenical councils, and Council of Nicaea was one of the 7 great councils of ancient times. And then it gets it from papal proclamations, ecumenicals. Okay, and those happened in the last 16th centuries as well. Emperor Constantine calls the first. So the Emperor of Rome calls a council to discuss church theology, and he's present either in person. So here you have the mix of politics with religion. The role of bishops in the government. There will be bishops that are advisors throughout the centuries, you know, up until the 17th century, even to Louis XIV in France in the 17th, advisors, cardinals that have a presence in the cabinets of kings and political figures. the church will struggle for its independence, and then it will be heavily enmeshed with politics when it wins the day and becomes the official religion of the empire in 386, 387 with Theodosius. Okay, here, one of the most remarkable things in the early centuries, the fourth century, is the Bishop of Milan, Ambrose, will, to the emperor that proclaims Christianity as the official religion of the empire, he will call the emperor out. He either authorized or gave orders to exterminate in the city of Thessalonica in the Roman Empire a lot of people that were supposedly guilty of killing one of his generals, Roman generals. He will authorize an extermination, just brutal. Okay? The Bishop of Milan, when he hears about it, calls his hand on it and says, "You may not have Eucharist, or what you may call communion. You are excluded from the church until you repent." What did the Emperor Theodosius do? He repented. So already you see here, there's two-way street here. As a bishop can require an emperor now by the end of the fourth century to come this way. One of the other things that develops for, I think, obvious reasons, but that still doesn't make it, biblical, so to speak, is the advent of monasticism. One of the earliest is from Egypt, St. Anthony, and he is a heremitical one. He goes out to pursue holiness out of the middle of the desert. And that is one style of monasticism. Again, where is it found in the early church? It's not there in the book of Acts. And by the way, the group or Cenobitical type of monasticism, St. Benedict being one of the most famous, and then Franciscans, and the list goes on, of various ones that developed over the centuries. Well, that is understandable. When you have a corrupt world around you, many times I tell my students, there are times when I read the news and I want to go live in a monastery with you because I'm tired of having to deal with all these issues every day. I'd like to have only people of common faith and common understanding, and not be bombarded by all this stuff and have to do my homework all the time, about what's going on here. Well, is this biblical? Can I do this? Can I join it? Whatever. Here's a suggestion. Watch out. I could be wrong. I could be wrong about a lot of things. In the early church, who were the heroes of the faith? You can see it in the cemeteries of Imperial Rome, what are called the catacombs. You go there, and I think a few thousand of the nearly 4 million tombs in the 40 miles underground of Christians that buried their dead underground between the 2nd and 4th century. Well, there are some that are semi-arches instead of rectangular tombs. And I think those are the ones that died for the faith, heroes of faith. We call them martyrs of the faith. When martyrs fell away, when you weren't dying for your faith anymore, by the time Christianity was legalized, who became the new heroes of the faith? Let me suggest to you humbly, maybe the monks, those who retreated from society to form their own city on the hill and pray and study. That's what they did. Some of them having no contact with the outside world, especially the early orders. Monasticism is not found in the New Testament practice, but it's found by the 4th and 5th century. Of course, here's a quick list, and I'm about to run out of time, both because I've been talking for too long and because you may know this history already. But infant baptism, when did it start? Please make note in the upper corner, there's an image from a fresco of the catacombs in Rome, and one of them, St. Callistus, of the pouring of a bowl of an adult, what looks to be not on an infant, but on a child. When did infant baptism begin? Well, for sure, when the church father Augustine clearly says we are born with original sin. What that means is, since you had a high infant mortality, and I'll sit down a little while, if your baby died in the first few weeks, where did he go in the afterlife? If he were born with sin on his head, well, that's the question. If you believe, I lost my first son, his name was Christopher. I lost him in the act of birth due to some complications. What are my ideas about where in the afterlife he is? If you believe in the original sin concept, which was taught by the end of the 4th century by by a church father that is a major figure, St. Augustine in the Catholic Church. Well, you want something quick, okay? Quick baptism to send the child, if he's alive still, into the afterlife. Infant baptism, sprinkling. Baptistries will continue to be built in Catholic cathedrals, basilicas, until the 13th century. And there may be some now, modern day Catholic churches still have it, but most of their baptisms happen, they don't need the immersion anymore, because at least for the last eight centuries, they have only done sprinkling even of adults that I know of, unless there's some exception that you're aware of. The cult of saints. You went from martyrs to monks and to people like St. Francis or others that lived very holy lives of abnegation. And after they're dead, to be a saint in a Catholic doctrine, you have to be dead. This is where you see a conflict with the original text of the New Testament. When Paul writes to the saints in Philippi, they're not dead. So there's a difference of definition that happens over the centuries. What makes a saint? What makes a saint? Well, in the Catholic practice, it's somebody that you can light a candle to, pray to, as an intermediary between you and the judge, that being Christ. Okay? And so there you have the cult of saints. By the turn of the year 1000, it was already fairly well established. Transubstantiation. This came about, by the way, in the 12th century officially. And so what does that mean? It's the doctrine of when the priest, and only the priest can do, the miracle of the Lord's Supper. You can't do it if you're a deacon. You can't do it if you're not a trained priest. You say the right words, whether in Latin or now in whatever the language of your, in 1963, of your particular world that you live in, and you effect the miracle of transforming what is just bread and wine into actually the body and the blood of Jesus. Martin Luther will come along in 1517, and he's a monk from Wittenberg, Germany, and a theologian and a connoisseur of biblical languages, and he will say, that's not what grace means in the letters of the Apostle Paul. And he will, in the Lutheran faith, will take transubstantiation and turn it into consubstantiation, which means it's both the physical elements and it's also the body and blood of Christ. But that is, again, a transition that happens in the Middle Ages. When did Mary become the most worshiped figure in Christendom as a whole? She starts with traditions in the early church by the time that all those pagans come streaming in. They come from pagan religions where the gods had the feminine presence in it. And I think Greg will talk more about this. And there's Artemis and there's Aphrodite and there's all that. When they come into the church and say, where's the gender thing? The most prominent goddess in the first century was not Zeus or Apollo. It was actually Diana or Artemis. When they come in streaming to the church, they say, where's the feminine? And the traditions about Mary start accumulating, name of her parents, her consecration at the temple. There are wonderful 9 verses, basically, in the New Testament about Mary. She's critical. She's important. She gives birth to the Son of God. By all accounts, she's amazing. That said, where does she disappear in the New Testament narrative? Acts chapter 1. That's the last time we hear about her. Mariology is a big study. And by the way, the last 3 popes, Francis I, Benedict XVI, and John Paul II, are big Marian popes. And while some of my Catholic friends think this is a myth, there is a suspicion that there's actually, in the decades to come, if Christ doesn't return, the intent by some, when it's the right time, to make Mary as part of the Godhead. Part of the Godhead. Father, Son, Holy Ghost, Trinity, plus Mary. Make it a foursome instead of a threesome. I don't know if that'll happen in the next few decades. All I know is that it has been ventilated as such. All I know is that through the centuries, she acquired title after title after title after title. So that by the 13th century, instead of the churches being named after Peter and Paul, which is what early basilicas were named after, all the churches are named Santa Maria or Notre Dame in French, Our Lady, Saint Mary. Mary becomes the most prominent painting, sculpture, statue. You're looking at the statue of Michelangelo when they sculpted in 1499 with the body of Jesus laying from the deposition from the cross and his mother Mary. And it is a perfection itself, and it represents the presence and dominance of Mary in practice. I'm about out of time. I'll simply make reference quickly to these other developments in the history of Catholic Christianity. This large presence of this church on the scene of history in the last 20 centuries. It is good to know the story, in my opinion. Where did the cult of relics come from? From the cult of saints. What's a relic? A reliquary was a special room in a cathedral, especially of the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th century, that had the finger of St. Catherine, the head of St. Catherine, the robe of St. Francis, something that belonged to, dare I say, the cross, pieces of the cross, or things belonging to apostolic figures, New Testament figures. Of course, the historical reliability of the sheet of the burial of Jesus. It's called La Sindone. It's in the Catholic Church in Torino, Italy. Is it really the sheet that wrapped the body of Jesus? It's a very interesting visit. It has been proven by science to be a 13th century beautiful photographic image, except they didn't have photography, reverse. It was a work, an icon, so to speak, of a great artist somewhere in the 13th century. But how has it been taken? It's been taken as, well, that's the reason for you to go do a pilgrimage. Pilgrimage has become very important, especially in the 11th, 12th century. If you've got the sheet that wrapped the body of Jesus, you go to it, okay? And so there it is. The 8 Crusades, first one is 1099. Go take back Jerusalem from the infidels, the Muslims. Violence in the name of God. Wow, those are, in a sense, embarrassing times. Modern day popes don't do that. But popes called for people to do that in the 11th century. They had armies in the 16th century. Alexander VI, Julius II. They had armies and led them in battle. They had armor. That is not the papacy of today. They have reneged that since 1870. The Vatican guards are the secret service of the popes. They are Swiss nationalities, and they protect the pope. They don't fire shots anymore for a long time. But there have been times when, in the name of God, popes have called for the conquest of Jerusalem and the extermination of Muslims in that first conquest of Jerusalem, successful in 1099. Why? Because the pilgrimage is a special journey, holy journey, so that you can find your faith, you show your devotion. 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th century, 9 centuries ago. Well, Rome was one place, and Santiago de Compostela in Spain was another, but the ultimate holy grail was Jerusalem, the place where Jesus was crucified and where he also resurrected. One last reference, and I'll let Greg talk more about it, is plenary indulgence. Still there in Latin, on top of St. John Lateran, that one right here, the Church of the Pope in Rome. He is in a palace on the right side of St. Peter's Square, right by the grandest cathedral on earth, St. Peter Square Basilica in Rome, 2.5 football fields in length, 1.5 football fields in width. It's the most gigantic cathedral in the world. But another church in the Italian capital of Rome is the Lateran, and it's the Church of the Pope when it comes out of Vatican. And on top of there is a reminder to you, coming from the Middle Ages, plenary indulgence daily for anything, for the living and the dead. So the development of the world of purgatory, the world between heaven and hell, where'd that come from? And it's not found. Remember, 3 sources for Catholic doctrine. 1, the Bible. 2, councils. 3, popes. Popes, I say this respectfully, have in a sense a private line to God. When they use the words in Latin, ex cathedra, which means from the throne, they are metaphorically talking about the huge bronze gilded throne that sits behind the main apse of the Cathedral St. Peter's. They are as if sitting on the throne of St. Peter's. And when they speak, though, they claim inspiration, and that is from God. They have, in a sense, they write books and say other things that see them not claim that I got it directly from my ex cathedra, my phone to God. I and you really actually have a phone from God. It's called prayer. But that said, he doesn't give me any private revelations anymore. He gave them to the apostles. He gave them in the first century. I have all I need. It's contained in the New Testament. How much of this story do we know? If we care about 1.38 billion people in the world, we need to invest. We need to lovingly and caringly invest. How much of it do my Catholic friends know? Some do, but many don't. And so that is why I think it's important to have a dialogue and do it in love, fully understanding that we care about every soul and that it is the largest presence of a denomination in the world. And but one soul at a time is what God cares about. I think I'll stop here.